and teaching the supremacy of Christ in all of life.
Lord, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and you have the words of eternal life.
Whatever thoughts you have need to conform to what the Scriptures say.
Right here in the Bible, we have all the evidence that is needed to prove that Jesus is the fulfillment.
Every second of every day is God's grace on us.
That gives us the power to walk through life.
All right. Well, who can remember what we went over last week? Yeah, Brian kind of hit on it a little bit. Yeah. Well, who can sum up maybe what we've seen so far in chapter 18 altogether, what Brian taught on a few weeks ago and what we went through last week? What's going on?
Jesus takes his disciples over the Kidron up to the hill, and he is betrayed there by Judas and handed over, and being brought before the Sanhedrin.
Yep.
And Peter's denial.
Yep. You're going point by point, man. It's good. So yeah, Jesus and the disciples, they enter into the garden. He's betrayed by Judas and arrested by the authorities. Something Brian hit on. Jesus mentions a few times a statement that we've seen several times throughout the gospel. John, what's that? I am. And then to what we went over last week, he was rejected by Peter how many times? 3 times. And it's mentioned that he was taken to meet with who so far?
High priest.
Two different guys are mentioned. Who were those guys? Yep. And who were they? Tom already said it. Did you guys hear him? Yep. They were Jewish leaders. And I want you to get this part. What did Caiaphas say? Or it was a reference to something he had said earlier. There, right in the middle of chapter 18, verse 14. What did he say?
Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people.
Okay, hang on to that one. All right. Well, today we'll finish out the chapter, verses 28 through 40. So, would somebody like to read?
I can read it.
Okay.
Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death," in order that the word of Jesus, which he spoke, would be fulfilled, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this from yourself, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What did you do?" Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, so that I would not be delivered over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Therefore Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you yourself said I'm a king. For this I've been born, and for this I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? When he said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the king of the Jews? So they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber.
Thanks, Merkel. All right. Well, first of all, he's led where? To the what was the fancy word there? Praetorium. So what is that? A lot of your guys' Bibles might say something different.
Governor's office, official residence, governor's official residence.
Yep.
Mine says the palace.
The palace, the headquarters, the official office residence. That's where Pilate was. That's where he lived and where he governed from, right? So that's where they had taken Jesus to meet Pilate. Another thing here too, right at the beginning, is that second part of verse 28. It mentions a word. What word stands out to you there? Well, there's a couple. I'll tell you the one I'm wanting you to get. Defiled. Why do you think that is mentioned? Why do you think the author put that in there? Or what can we gain from that?
I believe they were not to mix with Gentiles. They would have been considered unclean, not been able to take the Passover.
Yeah. So they stayed outside, and they let Jesus go in and meet with them to remain clean so they could what? Brian said it. Yep. They could take part in that Passover celebration. They didn't want to defile themselves. Who was Pilate? He was what? Where does he live in? In the governor's palace, right? So he's the governor. So he was the Roman governor, Roman appointed governor from the years 26 to 36 AD. And I'd just looked into it a little bit. For a long time, people weren't even sure that he was even a real person. Like, there was pushback. Even though he's mentioned in some of the contemporary writings of the time, there was some historical pushback. By who, I'm not sure. Probably unbelievers, right? But in the 60s, they found a tablet that was a part of a building that mentioned his name, and they'd since found coins that were minted in his name. I didn't know that they did that either. There were different mints. Not all Roman coins had Caesar's face on them, I guess. But I learned that as I was kind of studying through this a little bit. So anyway.
What was the pushback?
What?
Just him being real?
Yeah, they just weren't even sure. They hadn't found physical evidence that he even was the Roman that he existed, right? Even though he was mentioned in historical writings from the time as having existed. But people push back wherever they can at times. So what does Pilate ask in verse 29?
What accusation do you bring against this man?
And what is their response?
If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you.
Is that an interesting response? Did they really answer his question? No.
They didn't give no accusation.
No, they didn't. They just said, well, of course he's evil or we wouldn't have brought him here. Right? Why do you think they responded in this way?
Probably because they had no real evidence of what he had done wrong to put to death.
Right. And in the same way that they stayed out of the palace, right, to not become defiled, I'll tell you this. I think that they're trying to not lie, right? They're trying to maybe subvert the truth in a way to where they don't feel completely guilty about it themselves, right? But in Luke, there's a kind of adds to the account a little bit. Luke 23:2 says, "And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar,' and saying that he himself is Christ's king." But that part about the taxes, we know that's not really true either, is it? What did Jesus say when they asked him about taxes? Does anybody remember?
Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Mm-hmm. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So we know that's not completely true. But it seemed like they're kind of reserved in their accusations, right? And I think it's because they're trying to distance themselves from what they want to happen. So what does Pilate suggest they do they're in the first part of 31, verse 31.
That they would handle it instead of Rome.
What's he say? In 31, sorry.
Yeah, take him. Judge him according to your law.
Yep, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. Had they done this?
I think they kind of did. Taking them at the beginning, right? Taking them to the high priest and stuff.
Yeah. Well, it seems like they've been trying to do this for some time, right? Over and over. Can anyone remember way back in John 5, a discussion that was had where it talked about, or Jesus is speaking there towards the end of John chapter 5. And he mentioned witnesses to himself. What were those witnesses? You guys remember?
The Father, His Word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one. John the Baptist.
Moses.
That's the one I wanted you to get, right? Moses. In other words, the law. And what did he say?
For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me.
Yep. Verses in John chapter 5, verses 45 to 47. It says, "Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you have set your hope. For if you believed in Moses, or if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe these things, how will you believe my words? So the very law that Pilate suggests that they use to judge Jesus accuses who? It accuses them. Why did they take Jesus to Pilate in the first place?
Because it says we are not permitted to put anyone to death.
I mean, it gives you their intention right there. So they could have Jesus put to death.
If I remember correctly, that was kind of the Romans putting that on the Jews, not allowing them, because by the law they could
Right.
put people to death.
Right.
So I think Rome said, "Well, you're not doing that unless it goes through us first."
Because Rome's in charge. Right. They're what's the word I'm looking for? They're a territory of Rome at this time. Right. So yes, Rome is in charge. They didn't want the Jews. They allowed when they took over an area, they allowed a certain amount of free reign to the people that they had conquered. But they always had their governor in place and their laws, which those people had to follow. And this was one of them, that Rome would be the ones in charge of capital punishment. So they had to take Jesus before Pilate, before Rome, in order for him to be put to death. Which is, yeah, in a way, it doesn't surprise me. They themselves couldn't really find fault in Jesus, and they just took him before Rome in a roundabout way to enact something that a lot of them knew that they shouldn't be doing anyway. But what was their motive even in doing this? When Caiaphas said those words that we talked about up a little at the beginning of the chapter, referencing back to earlier in the book of John where he mentioned them, what were they trying to do? That whole time when Jesus came on the scene, right, and he begins to have people following him and listening to him and trusting his teachings. What did these Jewish leaders, what were they seeing happen? Or what were they worried about continuing to happen?
If they were going to lose whatever power they had in their kingdom, it was all going to be taken away from them.
Right. They saw their way of life threatened. The possibility of that slipping away and even seeing it begin to slip away. So they were threatened by Jesus and his teaching. And they take him before Pilate to have the threat eliminated, right? So what does Pilate say after he speaks with Jesus and examines the situation? What does he say about Jesus?
Says, I find no fault in him.
Finds no fault. Blameless, right? Does someone want to read Deuteronomy 17:1, and somebody else get Exodus 29:1, and then somebody else get Leviticus 3:1? Those are all real easy. First verse.
I got Deuteronomy.
You said 3:1.
Mm-hmm. No, Exodus 29:1. Sorry. Leviticus 3:1, Deuteronomy 17:1. Deuteronomy, go ahead. Yep.
Okay. You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep which has a blemish or any defect, for that is detestable. That is a detestable thing to the Lord your God.
Go ahead, Jeff, with Exodus 29:1.
Now this is what you shall do to them to set them apart as holy, to minister as priests to me. Take one bull from the herd and 2 rams without blemish.
Leviticus 3:1. Now, if his offering is a sacrifice of peace offerings, if he's going to bring it near one from the herd, whether male or female, he shall bring it near without blemish before Yahweh.
So just in the first 5 books of the Bible, first 5 books of the Old Testament alone, at least 40 different times it mentions that the sacrificial animals had to be without blemish or defect. That's just in the beginning of the Old Testament. So what does that mean, without blemish or defect? What does that mean in reference to these animals we're talking about in these passages that you just read?
You mean like it would mean their outward blemishes, outward shortcomings, right?
The animals, yeah.
The animals.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Physical blemish.
Physical, yeah.
Yeah.
Outward problems, outward shortcomings.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we're talking about the best 4-H projects, right? The best, the grand prize at the county fair. We want physically perfect animals without blemish or defect. All right. You guys probably remember when we went back through the series a little while ago. We talked about the lives. Myrtle started to mention it a little bit, but talked about Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Moses, David, all these different guys in the Old Testament. And what did we say about Jesus in relation to these men? Yeah.
True and better.
The true and better. We just sang that song. Yep. Jesus is the true and better. Can anyone remember a few ways how Jesus is a true and better representation of these men? Maybe just a few examples.
He was without sin.
Well, sure. Yep. What about in specific, just to any of those guys? We sang the song just a minute ago, so right?
I don't know if this directly answers your question, but like a parallel that I see here is kind of, when you think about Pharaoh and Moses, and you see how Pharaoh had evil intentions, but God had intentions for that. And you see here with Pilate and Jesus, and John even tells us in verse 32, it says, in order, when he's talking about, when the Jews are talking about putting Jesus to death, it says, in order that the word of Jesus, which he spoke, would be fulfilled, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. So even though there was evil intention from Pilate, it was God's plan all along. So
God used it for good, yeah.
Right, kind of a parallel with Moses there.
Yep. What I'm asking for is maybe just an example of how Christ would be the true and better Adam, or Christ would be true and better David. Anybody have an answer to that?
Right, he would be a true and better Adam because he would represent. He would be a sacrifice, and he would represent humanity in a similar way as Adam, similar but opposite. And then David, he's about to be king, right? He talks about being king and being his kingdom not of this world.
Yep. Anything else?
And Moses as the one who would bring salvation from Pharaoh in Egypt. Also the new covenant maker. Right? So Jesus would bring salvation from their enemies, spiritually speaking, and then with the new covenant. And Isaac, the son of sacrifice. That's our Savior, Jesus. Yeah, so many. I mean, Abraham's seed, right? That's about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to Moses, leading his people into that rest,
Mm-hmm.
the promised land.
Yeah. So we see all these ways where Christ is a true and better representation of what these men were. They were a type, but an imperfect type of what Jesus was and would become. So look at this. Jesus wasn't an animal without physical blemish presented as a factor, he's not an animal. This is what they're asking for: an animal without physical blemish presented and sacrificed to a holy God to cleanse an individual or a family for a time. Right? That's what the sacrifices were under the old covenant. But Jesus is a man spiritually without blemish, sinless, right? As the true and better Adam, he did not sin in the garden when Adam failed and sinned, right? Without blemish, sinless, blameless, presented to a holy God to cleanse all his people forever. Jesus is the true and better sacrifice. And we see here in this chapter, he's been declared guiltless, innocent, blameless by Pilate, and he has the opportunity to be released. Someone read verse 39 again, please.
But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. You therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews?
So Jesus could be released, and Pilate gave him the choice to release who? He said it. King of the Jews. Between Jesus, gave him the choice between Jesus and Barabbas. And who do they choose? They choose to have Barabbas freed, who's a better representation of themselves. Right? Yeah, they wouldn't have admitted it. A lot of them had convinced themselves that they were doing something righteous, right? But yes, Barabbas, he's described here as being a robber. But it's also mentioned in a couple of the other Gospels that he's an insurrectionist and a murderer. So here we have the Jewish leaders in rebellion against God. And they're calling for the release of Barabbas and the murder of Jesus. So this is what we're going to see over the next few chapters. We're going to see Caiaphas' words ring true. I'll read back in John 11 where he said them for the first time. Nor do you take into account that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish. Now those are going to come those are going to come to fruition, but not in the way that he meant. And we're going to see Jesus, the true and better David, the true king, the blameless king, become the true and better sacrifice for his people. That's all I got, guys. Short one today.
Remember one thing here at the when we talk about Jesus could have been released, he couldn't have, because this was all the fulfilled prophecy.
Well, sure.
God was sovereign in all these actions of these people, and how he controls people's hearts, hardens them. So, yeah, it would appear that way. And if Pilate would have just took control of that situation, or if the people would have, but that's already written in stone. This was the appointed time for Jesus to be.
Yeah, and he'd said, right, the time had come.
No, verse 32, it says that he knew what kind of death he was about to.
Right.
There were other times where it wasn't Jesus' time, and he withdrew, so people couldn't take him or deal with him. This is it right here.
Yeah, Jesus wasn't taken by surprise here. He wasn't surprised.
For this cause I was born. For this cause I have come into the world. And so,
You know, and like I was thinking, like in Matthew 23, you know, where Jesus talks to those religious leaders and calling them hypocrites and stuff, you know. Here they're so worried about entering the praetorium and not being defiled so they can, you know, do the Passover, yet they're getting ready to kill the Son of Man, you know, God. And they're worried about being defiled, worried about their outward appearance and stuff like that.
Yeah, they want to be innocent in what. That's why I pointed that out. I thought it was interesting. In one of the other Gospels, it talks about Pilate washing his hands of this man's blood. Like he doesn't really want anything to do with it either. And it's everybody kind of wants to distance themselves from this horrible thing that they're perpetrating. You know, it's interesting.
almost like they all realize this ain't right. But
I'm sure some of them did. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions or comments?
I was kind of tracking too on the parallels between Jesus before Pilate and these authorities, and thinking of that through the Old Testament. You know, not just Jeff brought up Moses and Pharaoh. You've got all these leaders of Israel, these covenant men, before these huge Gentile authorities, these kingdoms, and it looks like things are about to end really bad for God's people, right? But yet God turns it, he flips the story, right? This happens over and over again. Think of Joseph too, right? Joseph being sold to Egypt, and he turns that into good for his people. Daniel, right? Thrown into the lion's den. Looks like it's over for Daniel, but God saves him. He's able to recall this dream, brings so much prosperity to God's people. And then Esther. Think of Esther, right? The story where Haman's got this plot to kill all of the Jews. But God has placed Esther in the right spot, the right time to flip it and save God's people and destroy his enemies, David and Saul. I mean, it just goes over and over again. So when we read this and we see the way this plays out with Jesus, continual reminder that this has been the plan the whole time. God's been trying to get us to see that. Don't worry, I've got it, right? I've got things right where I want it, because God's in the business of flipping things on their head and saving his people.
Yeah.
Thinking back to the beginning of the chapter when the Jews were trying to not be defiled for the Passover, but they've got the true bread that they're willing to give up. They're going to give up the true bread so that they're not defiled by the bread that doesn't last. Right? Just so much here, and then thinking of the kingdom. Jesus starts talking about the kingdom and the nature of it. Now it's not of this world. Or his servants would fight. Remember back to the beginning. What did Peter want to do for Jesus? He wanted to fight. He wanted to lay it down. What's Jesus say? No, this isn't the way.
Right.
Right? put your sword away. Right? This is the theme. This is why the kingdom of Christ will stand forever. There's no defeating it. Because there's no earthly authority that can stand against the gospel. There's nothing that can stand against a kingdom that can't be touched. Right? That's the truth of the new covenant that we're so blessed to be a part of. Yeah.
Amen. Anyone else?
I was just thinking real quick.
Sure.
I was thinking of Christ being the true and better Adam. Paul kind of goes into depth in Romans 5, speaking of Christ being that. Romans 5, verse 18. Therefore, so we're seeing this, obviously, Jesus is about to fulfill that purpose that he came from. Paul says here, therefore, as through one man's offense, judgment came to all men, right? That was Adam, resulting in condemnation. Even so, through one man's righteous act, the free gift came to all men, resulting in justification of life. For as by one man's disobedience, many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience, many will be made righteous. That's just so good. We're seeing Christ to do that one righteous act that will bring life and justification for all men.